So thanks everyone for coming. I'm Herschel Naklis from the Government Department and Rockefeller Center, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker for the Roger S. Aaron Lecture, which was established in honor of class of 1964 graduate Roger Aaron by the Dartmouth Lawyers Association to support the study and discussion of issues in law and governance at Dartmouth as part of its liberal arts curriculum. So Keith Whittington is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics and Director of Graduate Studies at Princeton University, and he's among the country's most prolific scholars of the Supreme Court and American constitutionalism. His work includes over 10 books, ranging from casebooks on con law and American political thought to groundbreaking work on constitutional interpretation and originalism, constitutional construction, and dialogues across institutions, and the political foundations of judicial supremacy. His work has also won some of the field's highest prizes, including the Pritchett Prize and the Greenstone Prize from the American Political Science Association. But more generally, beyond these formal qualifications, which of course make me very glad to welcome Professor Whittington to Dartmouth, he's unique, at least to my mind, in that he's one of the few scholars who can do three very difficult things at once when thinking about American law and politics and democracy. So Keith combines deep theoretical and normative engagement with the core tensions of American political institutions and system of government, with detailed historical scholarship that speaks to these core normative tensions, and precise empirical analysis of all of these issues. Now, most of us could only hope to do one of these reasonably well, and so I think it's a unique credit to Keith that he's able to do all three of these at once so successfully. And an example of this approach is his talk today. Again, this year's Roger Aaron Lecture entitled A Republic, If You Can Keep It. So welcome, Professor Whittington.
Thank you. So thank you, I appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation to come here. It's my first trip up to Dartmouth, and it was a nice opportunity to get up to this part of the country, which I hadn't yet encountered, and Herschel encouraged me to go the back way, which for a while I was afraid the result would be I would not actually get here, but I successfully made it through the back way, and it was very pretty driving up, so I appreciate that. So I want today to take a topic that is potentially timely and try to make it as boring as possible. So the American commitment to democracy and the idea that the United States is going to have a popular government is generally taken for granted. For a set of scholars in the mid-20th century, for example, they often characterize this as part of the liberal consensus of American politics and the American political tradition. And for them, this suggested that it was a very narrow tradition, that the consensus confined what the possibilities were within American politics, that we didn't take seriously the possibility, for example, of socialism and a more radical change, but instead we were sort of stuck with the kind of liberal democracy that we were born with and that we continued to maintain over time. And there's some real truth to those kinds of concerns and the idea of this kind of liberal consensus. But I think at the same time, this can obscure the ways in which non-democratic thought has actually been serious within American political debates and has been a prominent part of the arguments over time, but also the extent to which there's been real doubts and skepticism about the future of democracy in America. A great deal of debate over the course of American history involves trying to figure out exactly what does it mean to have a government by the people and for the people. What was going to be necessary in order to meet those aspirations, and how well had the American government that we actually had successfully brought us toward that ideal. So while there may not be a substantial amount of debate within American political circles over time about whether or not we ought to return to a monarchy or adopt a fascist government, for example, there's been a lot of uncertainty about what exactly it means to have a democratic government, and those debates can be just as vibrant and rich in many ways as arguments about whether or not we ought to move past democracy into some other kind of political system. So what I want to take today is a little slice of that sort of longer debate, and this is a piece of a larger project where I want to try to think through these debates that have occurred in American intellectual and political circles over what popular government is and what it requires and how well the United States is meeting these requirements. And here I want to particularly focus on the late 18th century, so the period leading up to the American Revolution Revolution, through the Revolution and the early Confederation period, and through the founding of the U.S. Constitution, where these sort of decisions about what kind of government are we going to have moving forward were very much on the table, and people were trying to figure out what exactly our commitments were. And that's captured to some degree with this sort of famous quote from Ben Franklin, who emerges out of the Philadelphia Convention that had just drafted the U.S. Constitution, and it's recorded by another delegate of the convention as he's walking out of the steps of the convention hall. He's asked by a passerby, well, what kind of government do we have then? What's emerged out of the convention? And Franklin responds, a republic if you can keep it, which has been interpreted and portrayed by a variety of political actors and activists over time as reflecting many things. And so part of it's a concern with the if you keep it part. Can you maintain this Republican government that's been handed to you by the founders that we're trying to establish, or is it destined to be corrupted and ultimately undermined? But there's also been substantial questions as to what exactly does he mean by republic? What does it mean to have a Republican form of government? And how do we know if we've lost it and moved to something else? And what is that thing that we're trying to preserve potentially? And that's often across American history been a source of real debate as to is there particular importance to emphasizing that term of republic? And that's part of where I want to come to today, is try to think about, especially in the early republic, as the founders and the revolutionaries are debating American government, what did they have in mind by Republican form of government as opposed to democracy? To what degree were these two contrasting and hostile ideas, and to what degree were they very similar ideas? And historians have taken different views of how to think about the relationship between democracies and republics in early history, and I want to try to take a stab at that as well, and hopefully it will open the door also to thinking a little bit about the nature of the kind of American government we've created and what's valuable about it over time. So one recurrent theme of American debate about democracy and popular government more generally is a tension between a kind of optimism about popular government in the United States and a kind of pessimism about popular government in the United States. So the optimism comes from the possibility that we can constantly reform and maintain popular government. The United States has made the best effort at trying to generate a real popular government in which the people really do rule in a significant and important way. The pessimism, on the other hand, it comes in two kinds of flavors. One emphasizes the pessimism about maybe we aren't actually maintaining those ideals. Maybe we aren't as popular of a government as we might like, and we aren't doing enough to be fully democratic. But the other kind of pessimism is one that maybe we're too democratic. We've given in too much to popular government, and that ultimately leads to problems, which suggests to the question of whether or not democracy is ultimately the target that we're shooting for as we reform and develop and maintain the U.S. government over time, or is it something that in fact we want to try to control and preserve ourselves from falling into a democracy, and maybe want to preserve something slightly different, a republic, for example, as opposed to a democracy over time. And this debate's really launched by Thomas Paine. So in 1776, Paine is really a ne'er-do-well Englishman who washes up on the American shores, having not been terribly successful back in his native country, but for convincing Benjamin Franklin, for example, to give him a shot in coming to the United States. And he comes to the U.S. and begins a nascent career as a journalist and editor in the United States when the American Revolution breaks out. And Paine immediately makes an extraordinary mark on American history with his publication of his pamphlet, Common Sense, in 1776, in which he makes the case for the American Revolution, and that becomes a touchstone ever since of what exactly the nature of the American regime is, what was it we were fighting for in the American Revolution, what were we trying to establish moving forward. But when Paine does that so successfully, he interestingly twists the nature of the American Revolution. He alters the understanding of what exactly we're fighting for, what exactly the conflict is between the United States and Britain, in ways that has very important legacies over time. So if you look at a lot of the colonial era debates from the 1760s and 70s, leading up to the American Revolution, and their arguments with Britain about the possibility of American independence ultimately and what their disagreements are with Britain. They're mostly over the kinds of rights the colonies have vis-a-vis the home government. They're questions about the relationship of taxes and nature of representation, and how the United States ought to fit within the American colonies at that point, ought to fit within the larger British Empire. They're arguments that largely take for granted the basic structure of the British system, and the question is, how well does the United States or the North American colonies fit within that structure more generally? And the argument eventually for revolution is one in which our interests are not being adequately represented back in the home country, and as a consequence, we need to go our own way in order to emphasize our rights and interests sufficiently. Paine takes a very different tack toward thinking about the case to be made for American independence. It's not one that emphasizes the ways in which American interests are represented within a larger imperial system and how well those are respected. Instead, what Paine emphasizes is the possibility of moving toward a more Republican, more democratic political system and rejecting the kind of governments that existed in the old world. For Paine, there's a sharp distinction between what's going to happen in the new world, in the Americas, and what's being left behind in the old world and in Europe. So Paine introduces a rhetoric that emphasizes and denounces the European governments, including England, but not limited to England, as being governed by crowned ruffians who simply couldn't be trusted to exercise political power more generally. As Paine says, every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted around the globe. America was the asylum of mankind, and in America the law is king. For as in absolute governments the king is law, so in free countries the law ought to be king, and there ought to be no other. America, Paine insisted, should not be ruled by a king. Instead, it should be ruled by the people themselves. And that emphasizes then that at the very founding of the United States, the very moment in which we're launching a revolution for independence in 1776, the project that we're committed to, that political project we're committed to, is suddenly now a democratic project. It's a project about empowering the people in this new form of government rather than simply going our own way and maintaining many governmental forms, but simply doing it independently of England itself. And we've been struggling ever since with trying to figure out what that legacy that Paine has left us requires and what it means to maintain a democracy. And among those who were struggling with this legacy was John Adams and James Madison, trying to work through both the Revolutionary period and ultimately the Confederation period, and ultimately moving into the constitutional founding itself of the 1780s. Paine argued that when a people agree to form themselves into a republic, it is understood that they mutually resolve and pledge themselves to each other, rich and poor alike, to support this rule of equal justice among them. They renounce as detestable the power of exercising at any time any species of despotism over each other or of doing a thing not right in itself. So for Paine, republicanism comes attached not only to popular power, but also to a sense of justice, to a sense of liberty, to a sense of freedom, a freedom from the kind of oppression that you get with kings and aristocracies that characterize the old world. John Adams was much less sure that that's what you got with popular government. And so if our goal, Adams is concerned with, is saying, if our goal is a free government, a government in which we will enjoy more liberty and our interests will be better protected, then it's not necessarily so obvious that a more democratic government is necessarily the way to get there. Adams is a crucial figure both in the Revolutionary period and then especially later in the Confederation and Constitutional period as he's trying to help develop this early republic and establish America on a firm footing. But Adams' reputation in the popular mind takes a hit during these years in the increasingly partisan disputes that are emerging at the very end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, where Adams is being cast increasingly as a skeptic of democracy, a skeptic of popular government, and perhaps then out of step with the direction that the U.S. government is moving more generally and the American political system is moving more generally. So Adams denied, for example, and found himself having to deny that he thought democracy has been more pernicious on the whole and in the long run than monarchy or aristocracy. And he reminded his critics of the lesson of the democratic rage and popular fury that had been evident in the French Revolution. Democracy had shown itself to be more bloody than either alternative types of government. And remember, he says, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. right? So from Adams' perspective, the last thing we want to do is establish a democratic government as such. The democratic governments are unstable, and ultimately they're oppressive in their own ways. The kind of government we want to establish is one that might have democratic elements to it, but it can't be characterized on the whole as a democracy. And others of the founders who were active during this period have similar kinds of concerns, although they might have approached it somewhat differently. So for example, James Madison worried that Americans were already experiencing the evils of simple democracy or a pure republic. And the solution to those evils, Madison thought, would nonetheless have to be a Republican one. It wasn't going to be possible to completely back out of a Republican system. It was going to be necessary to have some kind of Republican system, but what we needed to be self-conscious about the fact that Republicanism necessarily had vices associated with it, real evils embedded deep within them, and the challenge for a constitution drafter was how to control those vices and minimize the damage they might cause to the people over time. In trying to do that, Madison in part tried to change the terms of the debate. So he wanted to talk, for example, about pure democracy as opposed to republics. Pure democracies, he said, involve the rule of the people in person and were unavoidably tainted by spectacles of turbulence and contention. And by contrast, he thought a republic was a delegated government power to elected representatives, and as a consequence, much more trustworthy. And to that degree, he wanted to continue to say certain forms of popular government were going to be unacceptable and vicious, ultimately, but other forms of popular government would be much more useful at the end of the day. And the label he wanted to attach to those more valuable forms of popular government was a Republican form of government, in particular, setting up this contrast that people see later between democracies and republics. And we see this in all kinds of forms even today. So this quote that's offered as a sort of popular internet meme shows up on lots of websites represented from Thomas Jefferson, in which the claim is Jefferson says a democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take the rights of the other 49%. Jefferson, of course, never actually said that or anything quite like that. But the idea that Jefferson would have said something like that is very resonant in contemporary political debates, just as it's been resonant throughout American history, to emphasize the idea that the founders and those of the founding generation would have been quite skeptical of the idea of democracy. The democracy was a smear word rather than an ideal we were trying to establish. The democracy was too often to be regarded as the functional equivalent to mob rule. And there are reasons why we would have thought the early Republic figures would think in those terms. So for them, the death of Socrates and the way the classical republics had degenerated into mob rule was very much on their mind, and something they had been taught, that the problem of democracies was that they'd be captured by storms of passion and could violate individual rights and make grave mistakes, as indeed the classical Greek democracies had. But they also had sort of more immediate examples in mind. So the American Revolution of the 1770s was remembered as a two-faced exercise, even by many of them. So on the one hand, it's a patriotic triumph, but on the other hand, it was always risking the possibility of popular excess and abuse. And the question was, how do you contain that monster once you've let them free? There was some value in what was accomplished about the American Revolution, but it was very dangerous to empower the people in quite this way. And for many of the founders and those of the founding generation, the French Revolution emphasized that. So as they looked across the ocean to what the French were doing after the American Revolution, they saw the direction the American Revolution could have gone, how much worse it could have been if we'd empowered democracy. And so many of them took the lesson away from that is a lesson of further skepticism about at least a pure form of democracy and popular rule because of the extremes that it might give rise to and the ways in which it might be abused. As the French Revolution turned to the French Terror, this theme became more and more prominent over time of a real worry about what the future of popular government might look like and how could the United States avoid falling into the trap that the French seem to have fallen into. It's that kind of idea that then people picked up on in the middle of the 20th century and even in the early 20th century. So the anti-communist group, John Birch Society, for example, picked up on these themes, as did both conservatives and progressives in the early 20th century. The Army Field Manual, for example, the 1920s, instructed new American soldiers that the government of the United States is not a democracy but a republic. And it was very important to train new soldiers, who in many cases were also new citizens, to recognize the difference between a Republican form of government and a democratic form of government, and to recognize the United States' vision of itself was not a democratic form of government, but rather a Republican one, Likewise, Robert Welch, who was the leader of the John Birch Society in the 1960s, made this quote that's famous that they eventually put on billboards and the like, that this is a republic, not a democracy. Let's keep it that way. Right? There's some important distinction to be made between Republican forms of government and democratic forms of government. The United States is only committed to one, not the other. This remains a popular theme that can be found, especially on the right, with many conservatives who continue to want to suggest that it's a mistake to be thinking about the United States as a kind of democracy, and it's a myth that the United States was founded to be a kind of democracy, but instead we're something else. So as Jean-Luc Picard in this case tells us, the United States instead should be understood as a constitutional republic as opposed to a democracy, and there's something importantly different about those two things. So for the remainder of my time, what I want to do is go back to thinking about how did those in the early republic talk about these terms of democracy and republics? How did they think about that distinction? We have high-profile examples that we often wind up focusing on about how people like John Adams or James Madison, for example, try to draw a distinction between Republican forms of government and democratic forms of government. And my concern is how representative those ideas really are, and does this really capture how people are thinking about these differences at the time? And can we get more of a feel for the degree to which people think of these things as dramatically hostile to each other, very different concepts, the way, for example, the John Birch Society would suggest is the case? Or do they see them as effective synonyms, which a set of scholarly literature since the 1960s has instead emphasized and suggested that really, even though the founders often talked in terms of republics, they really meant democracies, and there was no important difference between the two. And so in thinking about that, I wanted to think about some specific questions and then try to think about them in terms of particularly the newspaper literature at the time, in which people were writing short essays in newspapers in which they're repeatedly thinking about democracies and republics and various forms of popular government, talking about what kind of government the United States ought to have, but also what's happening elsewhere in the world, such as in France, and try to tease out then how are people talking about these terms, how are they using these terms in political practice across a large set of authors and not just a handful of people like John Adams and James Madison and the fake Thomas Jefferson. So one question that we would want to be interested in from this perspective is try to think about, well, to what degree is democracy a smear word? Do people regard democracy as a bad thing that we were trying to avoid, or do they review it as an ideal thing that we're actually trying to aspire toward? To what degree was democracy different than a Republican form of government? Is there a sharp line to be drawn between these two things, or are they basically synonyms? With James Madison, should we think the republic is really a kind of representative democracy? And that's the characteristic form that distinguishes a republic from a democracy, is whether or not there's elections and representation as opposed to direct participation by the people in the making of laws as such. And of course, fundamentally, was the United States a democracy itself? Is it appropriate to characterize the US as a democracy, or is that a mistake from the perspective of those who are actually making these kinds of arguments in the early republic and around the revolutionary period? One sort of background context that's worth thinking about is that for many educated writers of the period, they're working with a classical vision of how we ought to organize different forms of government and think about them. One that's largely drawn out of Aristotle, but re-emphasized in lots of classical thinkers that many Americans, as well as others, are being trained in at the time, in which they distinguish two different things. On the one hand, we can characterize forms of government by who exercises power, what parts of society has power within those forms of governments. And then we can also distinguish them based on how well they exercise power. In particular, how are they using that power? To what end are they moving it? And so that can break out into this six-sided figure. On the one hand, whether you have the one, the few, or the many who actually exercise power, you might have a monarchy, an aristocracy, or a polity. And whether they exercise that power badly or well might characterize whether we actually have something that's properly called an aristocracy, for example, or whether instead we ought to think of it as properly an oligarchy. And commonly within this framework, democracy gets characterized as ruled by the many, but a form of bad government. It's when the people are ruling, but they're ruling badly and for the wrong ends. That's what we ought to characterize as a democracy, as opposed to some other form of government, when the names for that vary among classical authors and their translators, that we ought to characterize as ruled by the many, but ruling for the correct ends. One way of framing it is a polity, and perhaps one way of framing it is as a Republican government as well. So how much does this kind of idea that democracy is a bad thing to be avoided rather than a good thing that we ought to aspire to get reflected in how people are arguing at the period? So this tracks newspaper publications of the period that's using the language of republics and democracies. In particular, tracks how much of the usage of either the term republics or republican or various formulations of that and forms of democracy had negative connotations. So when you talked about democracies, did you talk about them as being bad things, or did you talk about them as being neutral things, or did you talk about them as being actually positive and attractive things? And there's lots of noise prior to the American Revolution itself. So in the late colonial period, there are newspaper articles that talk about republics and democracies, but they bounce around a lot to a relatively small number of articles, and one shouldn't, I think, draw very strong conclusions from what's being stated in those years. But as we move into the late 1770s and into the 1780s, especially into the later 1780s and afterwards, a much more sharper pattern develops in which there's lots more articles being written that use this kind of language, and there's a much more sharp differentiation between how people talk about democracies and how people talk about republics. Notably, people rarely refer to republics as being bad things. Republics are mostly being offered as a positive thing, hardly ever used as a way of talking about a bad form of government that's to be avoided. Instead, they're often represented as being the ideal form of government toward which we ought to be striving. Democracies, on the other hand, often are characterized as a bad form of government to be avoided. So unlike some historians who emphasize the idea that democracy and republics in this period should really be regarded as synonyms and people move back and forth between them, didn't necessarily have negative views about democracy, I think that's simply overstated. In fact, as most people are arguing in the newspaper literature of the time, they often see democracies as being, in fact, quite problematic. And when they wanted to talk about a bad form of popular government, the language they would reach to talk about that often was a democratic form of government. So, for example, democracies were often understood to be subject to annual fraud in election, faction, and violence. Those were characteristic features of a democratic form of government. By contrast, Republican governments were applauded for representing Republican freedom. They applauded legislatures and town councils that were composed of Republican ideas and principles. They praised politicians who were characterized as true Republicans who had Whig principles, right, as opposed to those who acted like Democrats. And in general, if you acted like a Democrat, this was regarded as a bad thing. In the early period, that is to say, in the American Revolution and the years before, there was a bit more of a tendency to talk about them as synonyms. It was not uncommon to talk about democratic republics, for example, or for people to talk about democracies or a republic, as if they were basically the same form of government. You could move back and forth between both languages. But by the time you move into the 1790s and the French Revolution is increasingly an example of concern, there's a much sharper distinction that's being drawn at that point, where France is often characterized as a pure democracy, as democratic government in action. And there's a concern that that kind of democratic government is going to be imported into the United States. And as some papers characterize, for example, that we'll have American Jacobins with a thirst for blood who will be importing democracy into the United States. By contrast, the United States was committed to a kind of Republican government that looked quite different and ought to be understood to be quite different than what was being offered in France at the time. So if that's true, then what is this new Republican government? So Madison suggests, well, the difference between republics and democracies is that republics can be identified with elections and representation. So the fact that you have a legislature that's elected to represent the people is what makes it a republic, as opposed to a democracy where everybody gathers together and makes decisions on the whole. It turns out that's not a very common way of making this distinction at the time. Madison is idiosyncratic rather than actually representative in how he wants to talk about republics and how they are identified. So sometimes republics are identified with elections, but often they're not. And democracies are perfectly capable of being characterized as involving representative structures and involving elections in general. So often you'd see, for example, compound descriptors in the newspapers of representative democracies as opposed to simple democracies, such that it's possible to distinguish between different kinds of democratic forms. And the idea that you can have representation in an election as part of the democratic form seemed perfectly natural to them, rather than think, no, now you've moved outside the context of democracy, now you're doing something else. More common than Madison's emphasis on the idea of elections is that when people argue about what makes for a republic, they're more likely to focus on the idea of republics rule in the public interest broadly. Right? It's what the goal of the government is. What ends are we serving with this government? And do we look out for the public as a whole, the general public, or are we looking out for the interests of a particular group within society that distinguishes between republics and democracies? Likewise, there's an emphasis on the rule of law versus the rule of men. So what's characteristic of Republicans and a republic as opposed to a democracy is that while it has a popular component to it, it's a popular component that's governed by a rule of law, that's concerned with stability, that's concerned with rights, whereas on the other hand, democracies are not concerned with any of those things. It's pure anarchy in the sense of it's pure arbitrary decision making. Whatever it is the mob wants to do today is what we're going to do, whereas republics, on the other hand, are guided by more stable principles that will continue over time. So when people try to put their finger on what the difference is between republics and democracies, they're much less concerned about these immediate institutional features of do you have elections, do you have legislatures, the way Madison wants to suggest. Instead, what they're much more concerned with is what's the purpose of the government and how is the government operating, what are the practices that characterize that government, rather than what are the institutions that characterize that government. And in that sense, then what has to be maintained in the United States is not necessarily elections per se, but what has to be maintained is the emphasis on the rule of law and the public good more broadly. And of course, there's this basic question of do people think about the United States as being a democracy, or people avoid characterizing the United States as a democracy? And I think it's notable, though, that despite the fact that democracy is often used in relatively negative ways, nonetheless, it becomes fairly common to talk about the United States as a democracy. People didn't necessarily object to characterizing the new American government as being a kind of democratic government. They often wanted to add adjectives to it in various ways. Of course, we're a complex democracy, not a simple democracy. We're not a pure democracy. We're a compound democracy, or we're a Republican democracy in particular. But there's not necessarily an effort to say, don't attach the democratic label to us at all. Instead, there's a perfect recognition that it's possible to think about the United States in democratic terms, and that's acceptable. So in general, I would want to suggest that recent historians have tried too hard to flatten out the difference between republics and democracies as they were understood at the time. But at the same time, modern conservatives have gone too far in trying to draw out stark distinctions between the two. Early Americans certainly wanted to avoid the stormy democracies of Greece and Italy as they saw it, for example, and they wanted to avoid the terrors of the French Revolution that was contemporaneous with their own actions. But doing so did not necessarily require rejecting democracy as such. It meant trying to embrace popular government, but then trying to confine it in particular ways, guide it in particular ways moving forward, which meant ultimately for Americans that the goal of a good government was try to combine this popular element that might get represented in a legislature, the democratic part, as they would often characterize it, of an American political system, with other components that emphasized the rule of law, emphasized justice, emphasized rules, and simply didn't give in to mob mentality, but instead was also trying to inject an element of stability and freedom and constraint into popular government as a whole. And what's important then about the American system was that it was finding its way to balance these two goals together, not to reject democracy as such, but to figure out how to bring democracy into a stable constitutional order rather than simply giving yourself in to democracy as such. And Republic then characterized that ideal to a much greater degree, not by rejecting democracy as such, but by trying to figure out how to manage democracy a little better. So thank you very much. So I understand there are time for questions and a microphone in the back so that you can be recorded for posterity if you have a question.
Thank you so much.
Just a question. So you spoke about sort of how there's popular government elements and maybe call it aristocratic elements within our Constitution, within our government. Could you, this is but could you highlight maybe times where you felt that the effort towards popular government may have gone too far and tendencies towards aristocracy that have gone too far, in a sense, like moments in history where we have gone maybe too far with our desires for democracy or to institutionalize democracy in our government or to limit that essence of democracy.
Yeah, I think part of what's interesting about the American debate over popular government as it takes place starting with the founding and afterwards is trying to figure out when have you gone too far. And there's disagreement about that over time. And so things that from the perspective of those who fought the American Revolution would have seemed like too far, by the Jacksonian era didn't seem nearly far enough as you move toward democracy. And so it's a constantly moving goalpost in lots of ways about trying to figure out, well, what does it mean to really have a solid popular government? When have we gone too far and when we haven't? But at the same time, there's lots of concern all along that path in which you're also saying, but did we make a mistake here? Have we gone too far already? So you see this by, for example, debates that are occurring in the late 19th century, where at that point suffrage has been dramatically expanded. Far more people get to participate in electing various government officials. State constitutions have been rewritten, for example, to allow shorter terms of offices in many cases and allow far more government officials to be elected, like judges, for example. And by the late 19th century, you see objections starting to emerge that maybe we've gone too far here. Maybe the people that we've now authorized to be citizens and cast ballots actually are not capable of making good decisions. And as a consequence, the government's going to go awry. They're going to be manipulated in various ways. At that time, there's particular concern they're going to be manipulated by party bosses, for example. And then the effort is to try to, okay, how do we pull back from that? How do we confine that in various ways? And the answer is often the Madisonian answer, right? Not to reject Republican government and democracy as such, but how do we find a democratic solution to this democratic problem? So given that we're not going to take away the vote from people, right, how do we move forward in order to try to make the vote safe in various kinds of ways? And that's the struggle, I think, that continues to exist over the course of American government, where there's a constant pressure to become more democratic in some ways. And there's always debate about what it means to become more democratic. But alongside that debate is also a debate that says, well, how do we make that work well? And how do we avoid making mistakes as we're also trying to be more democratic? And sometimes it takes the form of, let's not be more democratic. But often it takes the form of, okay, given that we're going to become more democratic, how do we confine that and contain it and guide it so it will work better? Right, but I think in some ways we see a version of that's even occurring now in the primary debate, right? So you see sort of Donald Trump emerging out of the Republican primaries, and suddenly there's a debate about, well, gee, maybe the Republican Party should have more superdelegates. Right? Precisely in order to block somebody like a Donald Trump, right? And it's precisely that same kind of reaction that's often occurring over the course of American history of trying to think about, well, that's what democracy gives you. Maybe that's not such a great idea. How can we pull back a little bit on that and confine it? And that's not to say, therefore, we shouldn't have primaries anymore, for example, but it does suggest maybe there's a way of modifying the way in which we do primaries that are going to come out with better results in the end. And that's a very characteristic kind of way in which Americans have grappled with these kind of problems. That they worry on the one hand, but there rarely is the response to say, therefore, let's be less democratic. The response often is more instead to say, well, how can we find a democratic fix to the problems? Yes, ma'am.
I enjoyed your talk very, very much. And I come here because of my research on the French Revolution that I did through Michelet. Did I read your chart properly in which it looked like by 1800, the beginning of the 19th century, the distinction between democracy and republic seemed to have been eroded.
Oh.
In the other,
maybe you're thinking about this one?
This one.
Yeah, so I think some of the distinction gets eroded. So there's, I think, a blip where there's this issue of how much you can, of when you talk about representative government, are you, like Madison, then ruling out democracies, and that just becomes the definition of what you mean by Republican government. And there is a little window where that becomes a little more common, and people want to think about that relationship between elections and whether or not you are out of the democratic box once you've introduced elections, and then that fades off again. So I think on that particular question about how important are elections to defining the boundaries of democracy and how do we characterize different kinds of popular governments, and often that debate is taking place in reference to what's going on in France, where the concern is, is the concern that in fact they don't have enough elections, is not filtering enough in France, for example. But that particular kind of concern does fade out, I think, over time, and by the time you get into the 1800s. But it doesn't collapse in this other way, for example, of, well, are you more like, when you talk about a bad form of popular government, are you more likely to talk about it being democratic, or are you more likely to talk about it being Republican, for example? That becomes very persistent. When people want to talk about a bad version of popular government, they continue to talk about it as being too democratic, whereas they almost never say it's too Republican. That's not the way they want to talk about bad governments. Republicans are almost always a good kind of government, whereas democracies are quite often, when it's not used in a relatively neutral way, when it has some kind of valence, it's often characterized as being bad. Yeah.
If the distinction that the founders made, as you said, between a Republican government and a Democratic government was the reigning in popular democracy,
Right.
Then how can you reconcile the fact that during the ratification of the Constitution, one of the biggest issues was the federal judiciary and the executive and their kind of independence from the people?
Well, so there's some question about how independent they should be from the people as opposed to how independent should they be from each other. I mean, I think the crucial thing that many of the Federalists are concerned with in the Philadelphia Convention is they buy into the idea, advocated by Montesquieu and plenty of others, that you need separate branches of government, you need to keep powers separated. And their concern is that those powers will tend to collapse, and they'll tend to collapse into the legislature in particular. So there's a lot of concern to say, well, how do we set up an executive branch or a judicial branch that won't eventually be absorbed or dominated by this other branch? I think later there is more of a concern that, for example, the Federalists by the 1800s are trotting out against the Jeffersonians. No, judiciary is meant to be independent of the people themselves. And Jefferson's reaction to that is to say, well, nobody's independent of the people themselves. The people themselves govern everything. They're just intended to be separate from the executive branch. And that's the purpose of designing the judiciary like that. And so I think eventually that argument emerges as being one of how do we have or do we need institutions embedded into the American political system that we see as independent or relatively unconstrained by the people. And then there are real disagreements about would that be a good thing or not. I think at the time, 1787, thereabouts, I don't think that's quite as immediate of a concern of how they want to think about it. The concern is much more about how do we prevent the legislature from dominating rather than how do we prevent the people per se from dominating. And for Madison, for example, has some pessimism about your ability to prevent the people per se. I mean, Madison sort of thinks once you've committed yourself to a popular form of government, the people are going to dominate everything. There's just no way around it. And so then the question is how to make it work as well as possible given that fact. And then there's a lot of concern of, well, how do we keep it all just from collapsing into one glob in which the public opinion polls are just pushing it all around. But he doesn't have any real illusions about the idea of somehow you're going to have an aristocratic part of the government that somehow is going to stay independent of the people themselves. Madison thinks it's probably a fool's errand. Yeah, there.
How are these data collected? Was it like just reading or machine gathered, or and
so,
especially with the like correlation? I think it was the second graph. Like, what does that mean? Like, how do you code for the correlation?
Right. So the machines in this place are in this case are undergraduate students and some graduate students, and so. So I did some of the coding myself, but a lot of it's actually delegated to students, and I gave them So I gave them characterizations of how to think about classifying this. So it's when they use the word democracy in this article, are they characterizing it as government that has elections? Are they specifically distinguishing it from governments with elections, or is it not clear and they aren't saying one thing or another about elections per se, for example? when they talk about democracy, are they saying democracy is a pejorative, that's a bad thing, or are they characterizing it as normatively attractive, an ideal thing, or is it just a neutral characterization of a kind of government, for example? And then have some examples of different ways in which it played out. So then the goal is just find, in this case, thousands of articles that are published during the period that use the term democracy and republic. So I suspect that in the long run, you could actually get machines to do this. I think we're closer and closer to having text readers that can be mechanized that will do this, that do this kind of stuff fairly effectively, actually, because this is fairly straightforward about how it wants to try to code distinctions. What I really took advantage of is the fact that we have digital archives, so it's easily accessible to get lots of newspapers, and you can search for words like democracy in those newspapers in order to distinguish the set of articles that would be relevant. And 20 years ago, it just wouldn't have been possible to even look at large sets. So when historians are talking about and writing these kinds of articles, talking about how are the early republics or the revolutionaries talking about democracy and republic, they necessarily go to, okay, well, how did John Adams talk about it? How did James Madison talk about it? Because it's too hard to do anything else. And so part of what's attractive here is now you can cast a much broader net and see a lot more people and how do they use that language in the public sphere. Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask, generally, how dominant the two terms that you've been discussing were in the sort of overall universe of terms that people in this period were using, because I sort of wonder how much democracies and republics were sort of in the same general family as distinguishing from despotism, aristocracy, monarchy, and you might start to see a divergence in the valence of those terms once you've gotten rid of the king and you're pretty sure there's not going to be a landed aristocracy, et cetera. So
yeah, no, I think that's right. And so I think one thing that's striking, which I didn't show you here, but is true of the data, that is that often democracy is just used as a relatively neutral term to describe a kind of government. So, so unlike what some conservative writers in the 20th century would have said, is democracy is always a pejorative and used negatively. In fact, it's often used neutrally, and it's used precisely to distinguish between whether there are monarchies and then there's popular governments, and we call those popular governments democracies as such. And then there's some fraction in which they either wind up saying, and let's talk about that in either positive or negative ways. And when they talk about it negatively, it tends to be democracies that they use to talk about it negatively. But there's a huge number of cases where both the word democracy and republic is used in just kind of a neutral way to try to distinguish it from kings and aristocracies and the like. And you see a lot of usage of that sort. And they're spending a lot of time in this period thinking in those terms of how do we distinguish different kinds of governments in sort of these kinds of basic ways. And you're right, once you get past that, and it does sort of, after you sort of get through really sort of the early 1780s, and so you get past independence, you get into the American Constitution period, you do get past some of these early discussions where people are just sort of laying out topologies and a lot more discussion of, well, we don't want to be like France. And so what's the difference between us and France? Well, the problem is they're a democracy, and that's not really what we are, kind of thing. And so the neutral usage declines a little bit as you move forward, and they're talking, the kinds of things they're writing where they use that kind of language just becomes a little different over time. You're pointing up there, or you're waving for yourself? There you go, self-interested in the Bible.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this really interesting talk. I have a question about this graph and the second one that you presented.
Sure.
And as you talked about it, you mentioned that it means to be, as it reads, proportion or proportional usage of republic and democracy, with percentages listed on the y-axis.
Right.
Number one. And number two, if it is meant to be proportional usage and not percentages, then that's interesting, because of course you can have proportions of things remain the same even with larger absolute numbers of values increasing, which is to say, from 1782 onward, it could be the case that either the democracy or republic uses overall increase or diminish, with the proportions increasing or diminishing relative to the absolute number of those things. they might not go up or down in tandem. They might, go up and down independently. It would be helpful to know whether we're talking about proportions here or percentages, first of all, and also to get some more information, such as what the absolute number of instances of these terms were in the newspapers.
Right.
Going through these years, whether they were increasing, decreasing, and so forth.
Yeah, so it is proportional, and so one thing that's happening as it moves through time is you're getting lots and lots more articles that use this kind of language and talks about it entirely. So in the early colonial period, really prior to 1776, there's some discussion that uses this kind of language, but it's a relative handful of articles, dozens of articles in those earlier time periods. Whereas once you move sort of into the 1780s and 1790s, then it's hundreds of articles a year that are using this kind of language. And so if you were to pool this all, it'd all be swamped by what's happening in the 1790s, for example, just because it's much more common at that point. And so I think it's more useful to think about changes that are occurring over time rather than just try to group it all, because if you group it all, it does get overwhelmed by the fact that you're just getting more and more of these kinds of articles being written. But it is striking that during this sort of 1780, 1790 period, that as more and more stuff's being written, you do get this sort of this relatively consistent proportion of articles that are talking about democracy in relatively negative terms, for example, that's occurring during that period. The absolute numbers are much bigger at that point. You get a lot more articles talking about democracy as a pejorative, but as a proportion, it's not changing that much. Yes, sir.
Perhaps it's not fair to ask you, but perhaps you would be willing to leap ahead a couple centuries and make some comments on where we stand today.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think in lots of ways, the kind of concerns that are expressed about things we're seeing today, as I suggested with the sort of concern about primary season and superdelegates and the like, are similar to kinds of worries that you see expressed here, and they're very similar kinds of worries you start seeing expressed in the late 19th century, where there's very much this concern about are the voters smart enough to pick the right people, or do they exercise their choices wisely, and how much power can you really trust voters or average citizens to have, or do you need to contain that in some kinds of ways? How trustworthy are political operatives and politicians? Are these people who we ought to view as appropriate receptacles for power, or are they also corrupt in various kinds of ways and not very trustworthy? In the founding era in particular, their concern that they see largely driven by classical theory, although it gets reflected a little bit in what they think is happening in France as well, is that there's a natural tendency of democracies to degenerate into tyranny as you get demagogic leaders rising to power who make promises that can't be kept and eventually exercising arbitrary power as a whole. And they think that's the real danger that you have to protect yourself from. And so partially as they're designing these political institutions, one of the things they want to do is make sure you design an institution that can contain the demagogue that's likely to arise at some point down the road. And there are lots of elements of the Trump campaign, for example, that sort of fits their model about what they expect to happen in that kind of person, right? People who will say what seems popular at the moment and doesn't seem particularly committed to any particular principles over time, but might become very popular nonetheless, and may be, in fact, popular with the people, even if he's not popular with political elites more generally, for example. And so their goal, in part, is to, can we design institutions that can contain somebody like that and make sure that one, we minimize the prospects of somebody like that's actually going to come to power, but if they do come to power, can we minimize the damage they're going to do over time? And if you buy into then the characterization of Trump as like that, then it's a great experiment, right? To see how well the system works. So it's sort of failing on the first one then of keeping him totally out, but maybe it works on the second one of making sure the damage isn't too severe. I wouldn't necessarily invite us to engage in that experiment, but I think from the founder's perspective, they wouldn't be surprised that you get something like this, and the kinds of fears people have about both Clinton and Trump in that level. And their concern is, well, can you write that out? And can we design a system that's capable of writing that out? Because this kind of thing is going to happen every once in a while in a popular form of government. So I know that Professor Muirhead had a question down here that I keep ignoring.
Thanks. If someone from the John Birch Society were to come to me and say, I think there's a real distinction between republic and democracy, and I've learned from Professor Whittington that in fact there was, in popular usage, the distinction wasn't consistently followed. But that doesn't really matter because the distinction was employed by Adams, who is the author, you could say, of the Massachusetts Constitution, which was the template for the national constitution. Then by Madison, who you could say is the architect of the federal constitution. It's carried to us by the Constitution. So even if everyday newspaper writers or essayists weren't aware of the distinction, they created it and then made it authoritative. And the distinction is this, that a democracy means that the common sense of the people should be translated in a fairly unobstructed way into the authority of law. And a republic means that we should have rule by an elite that is relatively insulated from popular sentiments and passions, but is occasionally accountable to the population. And Madison was terrified about very democratic state legislatures violating the right to property, printing lots of money and devaluing the currency in which the few held debts. And Adams seems to have thought that there was a small group of people in the population who were just naturally superior to the rest. They posed a threat, but they also offered a promise, and they should have their own house in the legislature so they could contribute, that they would kind of own. And anyway, so that's a republic. Ruled by elites, and democracy is wiping out that influence of elites. I guess the John Birch Society person who comes to me wants elite rule. But a progressive might come to me and say, I also think there's a distinction, and I want popular rule.
Or they might also like elite rule. So I spent some time as I was starting up this project looking at sort of how this kind of concern about the distinctions between the republic and democracy sort of echoes through the 20th century. And John Birch Society is particularly prominent in making this kind of argument later, but you do see a lot of both conservatives and progressive writers in the early 20th century, and often they make the exact same argument that's similar to the one you're making, that that republics means that you have some insulation from the people. It's not sort of direct rule by the people, and there are certainly some progressive writers that think that's a good way to go, that we don't want that kind of direct rule by the people. There are others push the other direction and want to have something more immediate and direct. And certainly lots of conservatives that start making that kind of argument as well. And so, so I think then, and certainly if you go through the internet today, you can find actually this kind of discussion is shockingly common now, and often takes the form of, let me trot out lots of quotes of this type of this figure, for example, of the Thomas Jefferson quote, and you see this kind of thing all over the place on the internet as well, and often where there's lots of quotes from Adams and Madison and the like, and sort of let's line up the founders who are on this. And it's a little striking that maybe half of those quotes are wrong, and but half of them are right because Madison and Adams and others said some pretty critical things at various points about democracies, and so there's a real point to that, and so I think a sophisticated version of that argument is the one that you want to outline, which is to say, well, look, it is true there are lots of people talking in other ways about it, but the people that in fact we want to rely on, the people that are most influential in the founding of the American form of government, and in fact we think are probably the best at understanding the kind of government we want to create, were the ones that were relatively skeptical and trying to draw sharper distinctions. And so we ought to pay a lot more, so Madison ought to have a lot more weight in our thinking than some random schmuck who is writing op-eds in the local paper. And so, and that's a valuable point, and I think it's worth thinking about if we want to think about who is more sophisticated and offers us a better theory for understanding what democratic governments look like, and who lays their finger on the kind of vices that democratic governments are prone to and the like. And we're going to get deeper argument out of somebody like a Madison, for example, than some of these other writers. But I think that's potentially separable from the question of, which is how this often gets characterized in the historical literature of, in popular discourse at the time, these were just synonyms. And nobody actually thought there was a difference between democracy and republics. And I think that sort of knowing what sort of the everyday usage looks like can give us a handle on trying to think about, well, is that really true? And I think it starts to give us an opening to think some about, And to the extent they did want to distinguish, how did they want to distinguish? And then it points in the direction that people like Madison are elaborating in great detail. And it's a bit of a red herring when Madison says, oh, well, the republics are all about electoral institutions. That's probably doesn't actually capture even his thought very well about what the difference is, and it certainly doesn't capture what most people are talking about as the potential difference. But he certainly is pointing us in the right direction to start thinking that there are some important differences that come out of this mix of thinking about republics and democracies, and what are they? And a lot of them revolve around these kind of questions about what is the end of government, how stable is the government, to what degree is it respect freedom and the good, and to what degree is it relatively arbitrary and indiscriminate about how it exercises power. And a lot of the concern about democracies, when democracy is characterized as a negative, a lot of the concern is precisely that sort of the indiscriminate use of power, often for selfish ends of a particular part of what Madison would characterize as a faction within American society, and that's something to be resisted. Maybe one more. So in the back over here, because you have the highest hand.
What did Franklin mean by, if you can keep it?
That's not fair. So right. So it wasn't fair for me to actually start with that and then not to wrap it up in a neat little package. And I do think, though, so they are certainly, and you look at sort of these conservative writers, for example, who really are starting in like the 1920s, for example, and continue through the 20th century, who put a lot of weight on that choice of language by Franklin. He's saying something very meaningful by saying it's a republic if you can keep it, not it's a democracy if you can keep it, for example. And I think they probably put too much weight on that particular distinction. It doesn't carry all the baggage that they want to suggest that it carries. But Franklin is pointing us to a real concern about, it's a popular form of government. And can you preserve that popular form of government? And one ways in which popular governments can be corrupted and eventually overthrown is if they tilt too far toward what gets characterized in other contexts as democratic mobs and passionate decision-making and the like, in which case you may not to keep that popular government very long at all. Next thing you know, eventually they would say you get a Napoleon who arises, and then certainly the Greek states give us other examples of a tyrant who will rise out of that, who will then promise, I am your hope to make good decisions and you have to trust me, because we can't have these kinds of pesky democratic decisions that we've been getting all along. And that's a concern of Franklin and lots of others as well. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.